The town of Redemption Creek sat like a weathered scar on the edge of the Arizona Territory, where the red dust never truly settled and the mountains stood like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. It was 1882, and the railroad had yet to reach this forgotten corner of creation, leaving the town suspended in a harsh existence where God's word and the gun held equal sway over men's souls. Main Street stretched barely 300 yards, lined with sun-bleached wooden buildings that creaked and groaned under the relentless desert wind. At one end stood the Silver Dollar Saloon, where men sought solace in whiskey and cards. At the other, perched on a slight rise as if to look down upon the sins below, stood the First Baptist Church of Redemption Creek, its white-painted steeple the only thing in town that caught the morning light with any semblance of grace. Reverend Josiah Hartley had built that church with his own hands 15 years prior, stone by stone, nail by nail, sermon by sermon. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains themselves, tall, austere, with eyes the color of Judgment Day and a voice that could shake the rafters when he spoke of damnation. The townspeople respected him the way they respected a rattlesnake, with distance and careful deference. His daughter, Grace, had grown up in the shadow of that steeple, her life measured by Sunday services and Wednesday prayer meetings, by the tight collar of propriety that her father insisted she wear like a badge of righteousness. At 19, she was caught between the woman she was becoming and the child her father still saw, beautiful in the way desert flowers are beautiful, delicate yet resilient, with honey-colored hair that she kept severely pinned and green eyes that held depths her father had never bothered to explore. The Hartley house stood beside the church, a modest two-story structure that smelled perpetually of lye soap and leather-bound Bibles. Every morning, Grace rose before dawn to prepare her father's breakfast: salt pork, biscuits, black coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. She moved through her duties like a ghost, careful not to disturb the rigid order of their existence. "A woman's virtue is her only treasure," Reverend Hartley would intone over breakfast, his eyes never leaving his Bible. "Guard it as you would your very soul, for once lost, it cannot be recovered." Grace would nod, her hands folded in her lap, the words washing over her like water over stone. She had heard them so many times they had lost their meaning, becoming just another part of the morning ritual, like grace before meals or the creak of her father's chair. But beneath her dutiful exterior, Grace harbored dreams that would have horrified her father. She dreamed of horizons beyond Redemption Creek, of conversations that didn't begin and end with Scripture, of laughter that wasn't immediately followed by stern looks and reminders of proper behavior. Sometimes, when she walked to the general store, she would pause at the edge of town and stare out at the vastness beyond, wondering what it would be like to simply keep walking. The townspeople saw her as an extension of her father, pious, proper, untouchable. The women nodded approvingly at her modest dresses and downcast eyes. The men tipped their hats respectfully and hurried past, knowing that even a lingering glance could bring the Reverend's wrath. She was trapped in a cage of expectations, each bar forged from a Bible verse, each lock secured with a sermon. October brought the Harvest Festival, one of the few times the town allowed itself a measure of celebration. Lanterns were strung between buildings, and the ladies of the church auxiliary set up tables groaning with pies and preserves. There would be dancing, though Reverend Hartley ensured it was the respectable kind. No close embraces, no lingering touches, plenty of daylight between partners. Grace had been helping Mrs. Morrison arrange the refreshment table when Thomas Bradshaw approached. The banker's son had recently returned from college back east, full of city polish and smooth words. He was handsome in a soft way, with carefully pomaded hair and clothes that had never known a day's honest labor. "Miss Hartley," he said, tipping his derby hat, "might I have the pleasure of a dance later this evening?" Grace glanced toward the church, where her father stood in conversation with the town elders. I should ask my father." Surely one dance couldn't be improper. Thomas pressed, his smile revealing teeth too white for the frontier. "I promise to be a perfect gentleman." Something in his tone made her uneasy, but before she could respond, Mrs. Morrison intervened. Go on, dear. Young people should dance at festivals. I'll speak to your father if needed. The evening came too quickly. Grace found herself swept into a Virginia reel, Thomas's hand warm on hers as they moved through the figures. He was graceful, she had to admit, and knew how to make conversation. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, something hungry that made her want to step back. You're different from the other girls here, he murmured during a promenade. More refined, like a rose among thorns. Mr. Bradshaw, please. Thomas, call me Thomas. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. Meet me later, by the old well behind the church. I have something important to tell you. I couldn't possibly, just for a moment. Please, Grace, I'm leaving tomorrow for business, and I must speak with you. The dance ended, and Grace retreated to the refreshment table, her heart racing. She served punch with trembling hands, smiled at the appropriate times, and tried to forget Thomas Bradshaw's insistent eyes. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Grace found herself glancing toward the old well. It was foolish, she knew, dangerous, even, but something, curiosity, rebellion, or simple loneliness, drew her steps in that direction. The well sat in darkness, half hidden by a stand of cottonwoods. She approached cautiously, her best shoes crunching on fallen leaves. I knew you'd come. Thomas's voice made her jump. He emerged from the shadows, and even in the dim light, she could see his satisfied smile. I shouldn't be here, Grace said immediately. If my father... Your father need never know. He moved closer, and she could smell whiskey on his breath. Grace, I'm leaving tomorrow, but I had to tell you, you've captured my heart. Mr. Bradshaw, Thomas, please, I must go. But he caught her arm as she turned. One kiss, just one kiss to remember you by. No! She wrenched away, but he held fast, in the struggle. Her sleeve tore with a sound like ripping paper. She stumbled backward, her hair coming loose from its pins. Playing coy. His voice had turned ugly. Everyone knows preachers' daughters are the wildest ones underneath all that virtue. Grace slapped him then, the crack echoing in the still night air. Thomas released her, his hand going to his cheek, his expression shifting from surprise to rage. You'll regret that, he snarled. Grace ran, her torn sleeve flapping, her hair streaming behind her. She burst through the back door of her house and flew up the stairs to her room, her heart hammering against her ribs. From her window, she could see Thomas stalking back toward the festival, his posture rigid with fury. She tried to repair her dress, to pin her hair back into respectability, but her hands shook too badly. When her father returned home an hour later, she pretended to be asleep, pulling the quilts up to her chin and praying he wouldn't check on her. But prayers, as Grace would soon learn, were not always answered in the ways one hoped. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a bite in the air that promised winter's approach. Grace rose early as always, but as she descended the stairs, she heard voices in the parlor, her father's rumbling bass and another, higher, urgent. Found her hair ribbon by the well, Mrs. Bradshaw was saying, and Thomas has such terrible scratches on his face. He tried to be gentleman about it, wouldn't say anything, but when I pressed him... Grace froze on the stairs, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. He finally admitted that your daughter arranged to meet him there, said she tried to seduce him. Reverend, threw herself at him in the most shameful way. When he refused her advances, maintaining his honor as a gentleman should, she attacked him like a wild animal. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace gripped the banister, her knuckles white, waiting for her father to defend her, to demand proof, to do something. Instead, she heard his voice, low and terrible. Bring her to me. Grace stood before her father in his study, the morning light streaming through the windows like an accusation. Mrs. Bradshaw had departed, leaving behind the poison of her words that now hung in the air between father and daughter like smoke from a distant fire. Is it true? Reverend Hartley's voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he had thundered. His hands rested on his Bible, knuckles white with the force of his grip. "Father, please let me explain. Is it true?" Each word fell like a hammer blow. "No!" The word burst from her lips. "Thomas Bradshaw asked me to meet him. Yes, but I only went to tell him I couldn't. He grabbed me. Father, he tore my sleeve. Look." She showed him the mended tear in her dress. "I fought him off and ran home." Her father's eyes, cold as winter stone, moved from the mended fabric to her face. "You went to meet a man, alone, at night, behind the church where you thought no one would see. For just a moment, to refuse him properly—" "Silence!" The Bible slammed against the desk. "You have shamed me. You have shamed this house. You have shamed God himself with your wanton behavior. Father, I swear to you, your word means nothing now. The Bradshaws are respected people. Their son bears the marks of your violence, and you dare stand before me with lies?" Grace felt the floor shifting beneath her feet, the solid ground of her life crumbling away. "You believe them over your own daughter? I believe the evidence of my eyes. I believe the testimony of a Christian family. And I believe that despite all my efforts, all my prayers, the devil has found his way into your heart." He stood slowly, towering over her. "You will confess your sins before the congregation. You will beg God's forgiveness and submit to his judgment." "I have nothing to confess." Tears streamed down her face now. "I am innocent." Pride. Her father's lips twisted. "Even now, caught in your transgression, you compound your sins with pride. You will remain in your room until Sunday. You will fast and pray, and then you will confess, or you will no longer be welcome in this house." The 3 days that followed were the longest of Grace's life, locked in her room with only water and bread. She alternated between desperate prayers and raging tears. From her window, she could see the town going about its business, but even from this distance, she could sense the change. People clustered in small groups, heads bent together, glancing toward the parsonage. The news had spread like wildfire through drought-dry grass. When Lily Stewart, her closest friend, tried to visit, Grace watched from her window as Reverend Hartley turned her away at the door. Even Lily, sweet, loyal Lily, looked relieved to leave, and Grace knew then that the poison had spread to everyone. Sunday arrived with a blood-red dawn. Grace, dressed in her plainest gray dress, her hands trembling as she buttoned it. Her father waited at the bottom of the stairs, his face carved from granite. "Have you prepared your confession?" he asked. "I have prepared to speak the truth," Grace replied. His hand cracked across her face so suddenly she didn't see it coming. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her cheek blazing. "You will confess," he said quietly, "or I will cast you out before them all." The walk to the church felt like a funeral procession. Grace could feel the eyes watching from windows, see curtains twitch as they passed. The church was already full when they entered, an electric tension in the air. Every pew was packed. Faces turned toward them with expressions ranging from pity to disgust to barely concealed excitement. Thomas Bradshaw sat with his family in their usual pew, a few careful scratches visible on his face. He didn't look at her, but she saw the slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Reverend Hartley took his place at the pulpit, and the congregation fell silent. "Brethren," he began, his voice filling the space, "we gather today in sorrow, for sin has crept into our midst, sin in the form of lust, of deception, of violence against an innocent man." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Grace stood to the side, her legs trembling, her face burning from the slap and the shame of being displayed like this. "My own daughter," the Reverend continued, his voice breaking slightly, "my own flesh and blood, has fallen into temptation. She pursued a young man, attempted to lead him astray, and when he righteously refused her advances, she attacked him like a Jezebel of old." "That's a lie." The words erupted from Grace before she could stop them. The congregation gasped as one. "Silence, woman!" Her father's face flushed dark red. "You dare interrupt in God's house? This is supposed to be a house of truth." Grace stepped forward, her fear transmuting into desperate courage. "Thomas Bradshaw is lying. He grabbed me, tried to force himself upon me." The uproar was immediate. Women clutched their children. Men rose from their seats. "Mrs." Bradshaw shrieked something about slander. "Enough!" Reverend Hartley's voice boomed over the chaos. "Grace Hartley, you are no longer my daughter. You are no longer welcome in this church or in my home. Go and take your sins with you." The silence that followed was absolute. Grace looked around the church, at faces she had known all her life, searching for one sympathetic eye, one person who might believe her. She found none. Even Lily stared at her lap, unwilling to meet her gaze, with as much dignity as she could muster. Grace walked down the center aisle. The congregation parted before her like the Red Sea, but there was no promised land waiting on the other side. As she reached the door, she heard someone whisper, loud enough for all to hear, "The preacher's daughter was shamed." Outside, the October sun was bright and merciless. Grace stood on the church steps, suddenly aware that she had nowhere to go. No money, no friends, no family. The entire weight of her situation crashed down upon her, and she swayed, gripping the railing for support. "Move along, girl." Sheriff Watson had appeared beside her, his hand resting on his gun. "You're disturbing the peace." "Where am I supposed to go?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "Not my concern. But you can't stay here." Grace descended the steps on unsteady legs and began walking. She didn't know where, just away. The main street stretched before her, and she could feel eyes watching from every window, every doorway. At the general store, Mr. Henderson stepped out to flip his sign to closed. Though it was barely noon, Mrs. Patterson gathered her children and hurried them inside as Grace passed. She found herself at the edge of town, at the same spot where she used to dream of freedom. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had her freedom now, but it came in the form of exile, not escape. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat on the very edge of respectability. The last building before the desert claimed dominion. Grace had never been inside. Of course, no decent woman had. But she was no longer a decent woman. Was she? She pushed through the swinging doors into a dim, smoke-filled world. The bartender, a grizzled man named Murphy, looked up in surprise. The handful of patrons, drifters mostly, and town drunks, turned to stare. "Well, well," one of them drawled. "If it ain't the preacher's daughter. Heard you got a taste for wildness, girl. Leave her be, Carl." Murphy growled, but his eyes on Grace were wary. "You can't be in here. Miss, best move along. I need work," Grace heard herself say. "Any kind of work." The laughter that erupted was ugly. "Oh, I bet you do." Carl leered. "I got some work for you, sweetheart." Grace fled back into the sunlight, their laughter following her. She stumbled toward the boarding house, but Mrs. Abernathy was already shaking her head from the porch. "No room," she called out. "No room for the likes of you." By sunset, Grace had been turned away from every establishment in town. Her feet were blistered in her Sunday shoes, her gray dress dusty and stained with sweat. She found herself back at the church, staring up at the steeple that had once meant home. The parsonage windows glowed with lamplight. She could see her father's silhouette as he moved about inside, preparing his evening meal. For a wild moment, she considered knocking, begging forgiveness, confessing to sins she hadn't committed just to have a roof over her head. But then she remembered Thomas Bradshaw's smirk, her father's slap, the congregation's eager condemnation. No, she would not give them that satisfaction. As darkness fell, she made her way to the old shed behind the blacksmith's shop. It was barely shelter, reeking of horses and old leather, but it was hidden from view. She curled up in the straw, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to truly weep. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Grace Hartley, no longer the preacher's daughter, no longer anything at all, closed her eyes and prayed for the first time in her life that God wasn't listening. Because if he was, He had abandoned her as surely as everyone else. The Silver Dollar Saloon was rowdy that night, filled with cowboys spending their trail wages and drifters seeking shelter from the cold October wind. Grace huddled deeper into the shadows across the street, her second night of sleeping rough having left her hollow-eyed and desperate. She watched the warm light spilling from the saloon windows, listened to the laughter and music, and tried to gather courage for what she was about to do. She had already decided, if she was to be branded a fallen woman, she might as well survive as one. Better to serve drinks to leering men than starve in the desert. She was steeling herself to cross the street when the saloon doors burst open with such force they slammed against the walls. 3 men stumbled out backward, and Grace recognized them as Carl and his cronies, the same ones who had mocked her the day before. They were followed by a figure that made her shrink deeper into the shadows. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and more, dressed in black from his flat-crowned hat to his worn boots. A duster coat swirled around him like smoke, and when he moved into the lamplight, Grace saw a face carved by wind and sun, stubbled jaw set hard, dark eyes that seemed to hold their own storms. Twin Colts rode low on his hips, tied down in the manner of men who lived by the gun. "I told you boys to apologize to the lady," he said, his voice low and dangerous as distant thunder. "She ain't no lady," Carl sputtered, blood running from his nose. "She's the preacher's daughter what got cast out for—" The stranger's fist connected with Carl's jaw before he could finish, dropping him into the dust. The other 2 scrambled backward, hands hovering near their guns but not quite brave enough to draw. Any man who can't tell the difference between gossip and truth ain't worth the powder to blow him to hell, the stranger said. "Now pick up your friend and get out of my sight." They dragged Carl away, casting fearful glances over their shoulders. The stranger watched them go, then turned, and his eyes found Grace in the shadows as surely as if she'd been standing in daylight. "You can come out," he said. "They won't be bothering you again tonight." Grace pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. I'm fine where I am." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her disheveled appearance, the straw still clinging to her dress from her makeshift bed. "When's the last time you ate?" The question was so unexpected that Grace answered honestly. "Yesterday morning." The stranger muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. "Murphy," he called toward the saloon. "Bring out a plate of whatever's hot and a cup of coffee." "I can't pay," Grace said quickly. "Didn't ask you to." He leaned against a post, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Jake Harlan. And before you ask, yes, that Jake Harlan, the one on the wanted posters." Grace's breath caught. She'd seen those posters, wanted for bank robbery, horse theft, and a dozen other crimes across 3 territories. Yet here he stood, defending her honor and offering her food. "Aren't you afraid someone will recognize you?" A smile ghosted across his features. "Most folks see what they expect to see. They expect outlaws to be monsters, not men who buy supper for hungry women." Murphy appeared with a tray, setting it on a barrel near Grace with obvious reluctance. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread made her stomach clench painfully. "Eat," Jake said. "I'll keep watch." Grace's pride warred with her hunger for all of 3 seconds before hunger won. She fell upon the food, trying to maintain some dignity but failing utterly. Jake turned his back, giving her privacy while keeping himself between her and the saloon. "Why?" she asked when she'd finished, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. "Why help me?" "Maybe because I know what it's like to be condemned for something that ain't true," he said, still facing away. "Maybe because I was in that church yesterday, standing in the back, and I saw your face when your own father cast you out. That wasn't the face of a guilty woman." "You were there?" Grace's voice came out as a whisper. "Came to town for supplies. Thought I'd hear some preaching. Maybe remember what it was like when I still believed in such things." He turned then, and his eyes held a gentleness at odds with his dangerous reputation. "What I saw wasn't Christianity. It was a lynching without a rope." Tears stung Grace's eyes. After 2 days of condemnation, Someone, an outlaw, of all people, believed her. Thomas Bradshaw lied, she said, the words tumbling out. He grabbed me, I fought him off, but he twisted it all around, and everyone believed him because he's Thomas Bradshaw, and I'm just— You're innocent, Jake said firmly. I know it, and I'll claim your innocence before any of them if need be. Before Grace could respond, the saloon doors swung open again. Sheriff Watson emerged, his badge glinting in the lamplight, hand resting on his gun. Harlan, he said, his voice tight. Thought that might be you. You got some nerve showing your face in my town. Just passing through, Sheriff, Jake replied easily. Having a peaceful evening conversation. Watson's eyes flicked to Grace. With her? Boy, you sure know how to pick 'em? One outcast to another, I suppose. Careful, Sheriff. Jake's voice dropped dangerously low. Badge or no badge, I don't take kindly to men who insult women. The tension stretched taut between them. Other men had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Grace recognized several from the congregation, their faces hard with righteous anger. The preacher's daughter and the outlaw, someone called out. Fitting, ain't it? Sin calling to sin. She's innocent, Jake said, louder now, addressing the growing crowd. I'll claim her innocence before any of you, and unlike you bunch of hypocrites, I got the courage to stand by my word. You? Mrs. Patterson pushed forward. A thief and killer vouching for her innocence? That's rich. Ma'am. Jake touched his hat brim mockingly. I may be a thief, but I never stole a woman's good name, and every man I killed was facing me with a gun in his hand. Can your boy Thomas say the same about his treatment of Miss Hartley? The crowd erupted in angry voices. Someone threw a bottle that shattered near Jake's feet. He didn't flinch, just shifted slightly to put himself more fully between Grace and the mob. Get out of town, Sheriff Watson commanded. Both of you, now, or I'll arrest you both, him for his crimes and her for vagrancy. Vagrancy. Jake laughed, but it was an ugly sound. When every door in this Christian town is closed to her, when her own father threw her to the wolves, you people make me sick. He turned to Grace, his voice gentling. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe. I have nowhere. You do now. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked through the crowd, Jake's presence parting them like Moses at the Red Sea. Grace kept her head high, drawing strength from the solid presence beside her. Someone spat at their feet. Someone else muttered about whores and devils, but Jake's hand covered hers on his arm, warm and steady. At the edge of town, 2 horses waited, a black stallion and a gentle-looking mare. She's yours, Jake said, indicating the mare. Bought her this morning from a trader. Seemed like someone might need a way out of this hellhole. You bought her before. Before you even met me? He shrugged. Had a feeling. Don't ask me to explain it. As Grace struggled to mount in her torn dress, Jake turned his back and shrugged out of his duster. Here, it'll protect you from the cold and give you some dignity for riding. The coat enveloped her, smelling of leather and tobacco and something wild. For the first time in 2 days, she felt protected. Why are you doing this? She asked again as he swung easily onto his stallion. You don't know me. I could be everything they say. Jake looked back at the town lights, his expression hard. Maybe, but I've been riding these territories for 5 years. Miss Hartley, I've met every kind of sinner there is. The real ones don't cry the way you cried in that shed last night when you thought no one could hear. Grace's cheeks burned. You were watching me? Keeping watch over you, he corrected. There's a difference. Now come on. There's a full moon and miles to cover before dawn. As they rode out into the desert night, Grace turned for one last look at Redemption Creek. The church steeple still pointed toward heaven, a black finger against the stars. But it no longer looked like home. It looked like a grave marker for the girl she used to be. She is innocent. Jake had declared before the whole town, an outlaw claiming a preacher's daughter's virtue. The irony should have been bitter, but instead, Grace felt something else entirely. For the first time since Thomas Bradshaw's lies had destroyed her world, she felt the stirring of hope. The desert stretched before them, vast and dangerous and free, and somewhere in that wilderness, Grace thought, might be a truth more honest than anything she'd found in her father's church. They rode through the night, following trails only Jake seemed to know, until the lights of Redemption Creek vanished behind the rolling hills. The moon painted the desert silver, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Grace had never been this far from town, never seen the world beyond the boundaries her father had set. As dawn broke across the mountains, Jake led them into a hidden canyon where cottonwoods grew thick around a small spring. A rough cabin sat nestled among the trees, barely visible until they were almost upon it. "It ain't much," Jake said, dismounting, "but it's shelter, and nobody knows about it except me." The cabin was sparse but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table, and 2 chairs. Jake immediately set about making a pallet on the floor for himself. "You take the bed," he said when Grace protested. "I've slept in worse places." As Jake tended the horses, Grace explored her temporary refuge. She found supplies neatly stored, books on a shelf, Shakespeare, surprisingly, alongside dime novels. A wanted poster was tacked to the wall, and she studied Jake's likeness. The artist had captured his dangerous look but missed the kindness she'd glimpsed in his eyes. "Keeps me humble," Jake said from the doorway, following her gaze, reminder of what the world sees when they look at me. "What did you do?" Grace asked softly. "Really?" Jake moved to the fireplace, building a fire against the morning chill. "The first poster? Killed a man named Wade Thornton. Shot him dead in the street in Tucson. What the poster don't say is that Thornton had just finished beating his wife to death. I tried to stop him peaceful-like. He drew on me." His voice was flat, matter of fact. The wife was dead. No witnesses except Thornton's brother, the sheriff. Rest is history. "And the other crimes? Some true, some not. Once you're branded an outlaw, every unsolved crime in 3 territories gets laid at your feet." He set a pot of coffee on to boil. "I've stolen horses when I needed them, robbed a bank or 2 that was foreclosing on folks who didn't deserve it. Never took from anyone who couldn't afford to lose it." Grace settled into one of the chairs, exhaustion hitting her like a physical weight. "You're not what I expected an outlaw to be, and you're not what I expected a preacher's daughter to be." Jake countered, "Though I suppose you ain't that anymore." The words stung, but they were true. "I don't know what I am now." "You're alive," Jake said simply. "That's enough for today." Over the next days, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Jake taught her practical things, how to build a fire that wouldn't smoke, how to find water in the desert, how to read the signs of approaching weather. Grace discovered she had a talent for camp cooking, transforming their simple supplies into decent meals. In the evenings, they talked. Jake had a surprising education. His mother had been a school teacher before consumption took her. He'd been 15 when he left home, working cattle drives and learning the hard lessons of the frontier. "Why did you really buy that horse?" Grace asked one night as they sat by the fire. "Before you knew about me." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "You ever have a feeling that something's coming, like a storm building beyond the horizon?" He poked at the fire with a stick. "I've been having that feeling for weeks. Then I saw you in town sometimes, walking with your head down, looking like a bird in a cage. When I heard what happened at the church," he shrugged, "seemed like maybe that storm was meant to blow you free." Grace found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone. Her dreams of seeing the ocean, of reading books her father had forbidden, of laughing without wondering if it was too loud or too long. "My mother used to say I had too much spirit," she said. "Father tried to pray it out of me. Thank the Lord he failed." Jake muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, I know faith means something to you." "Does it?" Grace stared into the flames. "I used to think so. But if God was in that church, he was silent when I needed him most." Maybe God was the one who sent a no-good outlaw to buy a horse he didn't need. Jake suggested with a slight smile. On the fourth night, the storm Jake had sensed arrived in the form of hoofbeats approaching the canyon. Jake was on his feet instantly, guns drawn, pushing Grace behind him. 3 riders, he said quietly. Maybe 4. Get to the back corner, behind those crates. But the voice that called out was familiar. Harlan, Jake Harlan, I know you're in there. Come out peaceful, and we'll make this quick. Sheriff Watson, and he wasn't alone. What do you want, Sheriff? Jake called back. I left your town like you asked. You took something that didn't belong to you. The girl's father wants her back. Says he's willing to forgive her sins if she comes home peaceful like. Grace's hand found Jake's arm. Don't let them take me, please. Not a chance, Jake said firmly. Then louder. Miss Hartley's a grown woman. She goes where she pleases. She's confused, led astray by a smooth-talking devil. Her father's offering you a deal. Harlan, send her out, and we ride away. Nobody needs to die today. Here's my counteroffer. Jake replied. You turn those horses around and forget you found us. The lady stays where she wants to stay. Can't do that. The Reverend's offering good money for her return. Dead or alive for you. But the girl comes back breathing. Grace felt Jake tense. How much? He asked. Her heart plummeted. Of course. He was an outlaw. Everything had a price. $500. Watson called. More than you'd get robbing a bank. Jake was quiet for so long, Grace thought he might be considering it. Then he laughed. Low and dangerous. Watson, you could offer me $5,000, and my answer would be the same. The lady said no. That's the end of it. Gunfire erupted, shattering the windows. Jake shoved Grace down, returning fire through the broken glass. The air filled with gun smoke and splinters. There's a back way out, Jake said between shots. Through that loose board. Get to the horses. I'm not leaving you. Damn it, woman. This is no time for heroics. But his eyes softened for just a moment. I'll be right behind you. Go! Grace scrambled through the opening, hearing Jake's guns roaring behind her. She reached the horses, her hands shaking as she tried to saddle the mare. More gunshots. Then Jake was there, blood on his sleeve. You're hurt. Just a graze. Mount up. They rode hard through the darkness, Jake leading them through narrow passages and up treacherous slopes. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire echoed off the canyon walls. Grace clung to the saddle horn, trusting Jake's knowledge of the terrain. Hours later, when the sun rose over a different mountain range entirely, Jake finally slowed their pace. They were high in the hills now, surrounded by pine instead of desert scrub. Let me see your arm, Grace demanded. It's nothing. Jake Harlan, you saved my life. The least you can do is let me return the favor by keeping you from bleeding to death. He smiled at her tone, an echo of the preacher's daughter's authority, and submitted to her ministrations. The wound was indeed just a graze, but Grace cleaned and bandaged it with fabric torn from her petticoat. They'll keep coming, Jake said as she worked. Your father's more stubborn than I gave him credit for. Then we keep running. We? Jake caught her hand. Grace, this is my life. Running, hiding, fighting. It ain't no life for a woman like you. A woman like me? Grace met his eyes steadily. What kind of woman is that? The preacher's daughter? She's dead, remember? Died in that church when her own father chose lies over truth. I don't know who I am now, but I know I'm not going back. Not to him, not to that town, not to that life. You say that now, but you're the only person who believed me. Grace interrupted. The only one who saw my innocence when the whole world saw shame. If that's not worth loyalty, I don't know what is. Jake studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. All right then, but if we're doing this, we do it smart. No more running blind. I know some people up north, good folks who don't ask questions. We can lay low until your father gives up. He won't give up, Grace said quietly. He'd rather see me dead than free, in his mind. I've stained his reputation beyond repair. Then we make sure he never finds you. Jake's voice held a promise. I've been running for 5 years. Grace, I've gotten real good at disappearing." As they rode on through the morning light, Grace realized something had changed between them. It wasn't just gratitude or desperation anymore. In sharing danger, in trusting each other with their lives, they'd forged something stronger. "Jake," she said softly, "thank you for believing me, for claiming my innocence when no one else would." He glanced back at her, and for just a moment, the outlaw's mask slipped entirely. "Grace, I'd face down every sheriff in the territory to keep you safe. That's a promise." And in that moment, riding through wild country with danger at their backs and uncertainty ahead, Grace felt safer than she'd ever felt in her father's house. The preacher's daughter was gone, but in her place rode a woman who was learning that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources. The news traveled faster than wildfire through the territories. Reverend Josiah Hartley had put a bounty on his own daughter, claiming she'd been kidnapped by the notorious outlaw Jake Harlan. $500 for her safe return. $1,000 if Harlan was brought in dead. Every bounty hunter, sheriff, and desperate soul looking to make quick money now had their eyes trained on the horizon. Jake learned of it in a trading post 3 days north of the canyon, his face darkening as he read the freshly printed poster. Grace stood beside him, wearing men's clothing he'd procured for her, easier for riding, less conspicuous. $1,000, she whispered. "My own father. Makes our job harder." Jake said grimly, "Every 2-bit gun hand in 3 territories will be looking for us now." They'd been pushing hard across the desert, stopping only when the horses needed rest. The landscape had turned brutal, endless stretches of alkali flats, twisted rock formations, sparse water holes that sometimes ran dry. Grace had never imagined such desolation existed, but she didn't complain, even when her lips cracked from the dry wind and her skin burned under the merciless sun. On the 5th day, they ran out of water. Jake had been leading them toward a spring he remembered from years past, but when they arrived, they found only cracked mud and the bones of animals that had come seeking the same salvation. "Damn," he muttered, studying the barren ground. "Must have dried up last summer." Grace dismounted, her legs shaky. They had perhaps half a canteen between them, and the horses were already showing signs of distress. Jake's black stallion stood with head lowered, sides heaving. Her mare was in worse shape, stumbling on the rocky ground. "How far to the next water?" Grace asked, though she feared the answer. 2 days, maybe 3. Jake's jaw tightened. "We'll have to turn back, find another route." "We can't. They'll be watching the main trails by now." She was right, and they both knew it. Jake studied the horizon, calculating distances and dangers. "There's another possibility, an old Apache waterhole, sacred ground. Most white men won't go near it. Too many stories about curses and angry spirits." "Do you believe in curses?" "I believe in water," Jake said, "and I believe the Apache are smart enough to spread ghost stories to keep folks away from their resources. It's a day's ride, through rough country. The horses might make it. And if they don't," Jake met her eyes, "then we walk." They set out as the sun began its descent, traveling by night to spare themselves and the animals from the worst of the heat. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, narrow passes between towering rocks, loose shale that sent stones cascading into unseen depths. Grace's mare stumbled repeatedly, and finally, inevitably, went down. "Easy, girl, easy," Grace soothed, but the mare's eyes were rolling white, her breathing labored. Jake examined the animal with gentle hands. "Her leg's not broken, but she's done. Heat exhaustion." He looked up at Grace. "We'll have to leave her. She'll die. Maybe, maybe not. If we find water, I'll come back for her." He was already transferring their supplies to his stallion. "You'll ride? I'll walk?" "No, we both walk, or we both ride." "Grace, don't argue with me. Jake Harlan, we're partners in this, aren't we?" Despite everything, he almost smiled. "Stubborn woman. I learned from the best." They left the mare in what shade they could find, Jake pouring a precious handful of water for her before they moved on. Walking was torture. The ground radiated heat even at night, and Grace's boots, made for town streets, began falling apart. Jake gave her his spare socks, tore strips from his shirt to wrap her feet. But still, each step was agony. Near dawn, when Grace thought she couldn't take another step, they heard it, the sound of pursuit. Horses moving fast, raising dust clouds against the lightening sky. "Down," Jake hissed, pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. 6 riders appeared, armed and dangerous-looking. Grace recognized one, Bill McCready, a bounty hunter with a reputation for bringing his quarry back over the saddle more often than not. "They came this way, I'm sure of it," McCready was saying. "That mare we found was half dead. They can't be far." "Maybe they died out here," another suggested. "Save us the trouble. The Reverend wants proof, and he wants the girl back breathing, remember? Though after a $1,000 chase through this hell, I might be inclined to negotiate that point." They laughed. Ugly, predatory sounds that made Grace press closer to Jake. His arm came around her, protective, his other hand on his gun. The riders passed within 50 feet of their hiding spot, but the coming dawn worked in the fugitives' favor, casting deep shadows among the rocks. Still, Grace held her breath until the sound of hoofbeats faded. "We need to move," Jake whispered. "They'll double back when they don't find us ahead." They stumbled on, Jake half carrying Grace now as her strength failed. The sun rose like a furnace door opening, and Grace found herself thinking of her father's sermons about hell. He'd been wrong, she thought deliriously. Hell wasn't fire and brimstone. It was an endless desert with no water and no mercy. "There," Jake said suddenly. "Look." Ahead, the rocks opened into a hidden canyon, and at its heart, impossibly green, grew a cluster of cottonwoods. Water. It had to mean water. They half ran, half fell down the slope. The spring was small but real, bubbling up clear and cold from the depths. Jake made Grace drink slowly, though her body screamed for more. He tended the stallion, then filled their canteens. "Apache signs," he said, pointing to symbols carved into the rocks. "We're guests here. We take only what we need." As Grace's head cleared, she noticed other things. A fire ring, carefully stacked wood, even supplies cached high in the rocks. This wasn't just a waterhole. It was a sanctuary. "Jake," she said softly, "someone's coming." An old Apache man emerged from the shadows between the rocks. Moving so silently, Grace wondered if he'd been there all along. He studied them with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Harlan," he said finally, surprising them both. "Long time." "Joseph." Jake inclined his head respectfully. "Didn't know you were still working this area?" "My grandfather's grandfather found this water. Where else would I be?" The old man's gaze shifted to Grace. "This is the one they hunt? The preacher's daughter?" "Not anymore," Grace said, finding her voice. "I'm nobody's daughter now." Joseph smiled, a fleeting expression that transformed his weathered face. "Good. Daughters belong to themselves, not to fathers." He gestured toward the spring. "Rest. Eat. The ones who follow you will not find this place. The bounty hunters will ride in circles until their horses die or they give up." Joseph's smile turned sharp. "The desert has ways of confusing those who come with evil intent." They spent the day in the shade of the cottonwoods, regaining strength. Joseph shared dried meat and flatbread, asking no questions about their circumstances. As evening approached, he led Jake aside, speaking quietly in a mixture of English and Apache. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she saw Jake's face grow thoughtful. Then, determined, "There's a place," Jake told her later, as they prepared to leave. "North, in the Colorado mountains, a settlement where folks don't ask about your past. Joseph's nephew lives there, runs a trading post. He'll help us." "How do you know him?" "Joseph? Saved my life once, years ago. Found me shot up pretty bad after a disagreement with some claim jumpers. Could have collected the bounty on me easy. Instead, he brought me here, patched me up, sent me on my way. Said the desert had enough bones already. They left as the moon rose. The stallion rested and watered. Even Grace's feet somewhat healed by Joseph's mysterious salve. The old Apache watched them go, one hand raised in farewell or blessing. The McCready gang found them 2 days later. It happened at dawn, that dangerous time when shadows play tricks and exhaustion makes men careless. Grace was refilling canteens at a small creek when she heard Jake shout. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls. She ran toward the sound, arriving in time to see Jake dive behind a fallen log as bullets chewed splinters from the wood. 6 men had them pinned, spread out in a semicircle, cutting off escape. "Give it up, Harlan," McCready called. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Send the girl out, and maybe I'll let you die quick." Jake's response was a shot that sent McCready's hat flying, but Grace could see their situation was desperate. Jake had cover, but limited ammunition. The bounty hunters could wait them out or flank them. "I'm the one you want," Grace called out suddenly, stepping into view. "Let him go, and I'll come willing." "Grace, no!" Jake started to rise, but gunfire drove him back. Well, McCready grinned. "The preacher's daughter has some spine after all. But see, darling, I'm thinking I'll take you both, dead or alive. The poster said for him. I'm choosing dead." That's when Grace remembered the derringer Jake had given her, small enough to hide in her boot. For last chances, he'd said. She'd never fired a gun before, but rage made her steady. The shot was impossibly lucky, catching McCready in the shoulder, spinning him around. In the chaos that followed, McCready's men rushing to their leader, Jake using the distraction to deadly effect, Grace found herself strangely calm. She watched Jake fight with a desperate fury, watched 2 bounty hunters fall, watched the others realize this prize might cost more than it was worth. "Pull back," one of them shouted. "McCready's bleeding bad." They retreated, dragging their wounded, firing wild shots to cover their escape. Jake started to pursue, but Grace caught his arm. "Let them go," she said. "Please, enough blood has been spilled over me." Jake's face was hard, dangerous. The outlaw everyone feared. Then he looked at her, saw something in her eyes, and the hardness melted away. "You saved my life," he said wonderingly. "That shot, you're the only person who believed me innocent." Grace replied simply, "I'd face down every bounty hunter in the territory to keep you safe too." Standing there in the dawn light, surrounded by gun smoke and the echo of violence, Jake pulled her close. For a moment, they just held each other. 2 outcasts who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. "Come on," Jake said finally. "McCready won't stay down long, and he'll be madder than a scalded cat. We've got mountains to reach." As they rode away from another close call, Grace realized she'd crossed a line. She'd drawn blood to defend the man who'd defended her. The preacher's daughter would have been horrified, but the woman she was becoming understood that sometimes, in this harsh land, love and violence were separated by the width of a trigger pull. The Colorado mountains rose before them like a promise of sanctuary. But Jake's expression grew darker with each mile. They'd been riding hard for 3 days since the shootout with McCready's gang, and he'd been unusually quiet, lost in thought. "What aren't you telling me?" Grace finally asked as they made camp in a grove of aspens. Jake looked up from the fire he was building. "Joseph warned me about something. There's word spreading that your father's hired more than just bounty hunters. He's sent letters to every church in 3 territories, calling you a fallen woman who needs saving. Some folks are taking that as license to do whatever they want if they find you." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "He's that desperate to get me back?" "Not to get you back," Jake said quietly. "To silence you. Think about it. Every day you're out here, free, is another day his lie might be exposed. He needs you either under his control or dead." Grace finished the thought, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "My own father wants me dead. We don't know that for certain." "Yes, we do." She moved closer to the fire, wrapping Jake's coat tighter around herself. "I know him, Jake, His reputation, his position, his righteousness. Those matter more to him than blood, than truth, than me. That night, as they huddled close for warmth in the thin mountain air, Grace made a decision. "I want to go back." Jake's body tensed beside her. "What?" "Not to him, never to him, but to Redemption Creek. There's something I need to do." "Grace, that's suicide. Every gun in town will be looking for us. Then we'll have to be smarter than them." She turned to face him in the darkness. "Jake, I can't run forever, and neither can you. This has to end, one way or another." "What are you planning?" "Thomas Bradshaw ruined my life with a lie. Maybe it's time someone told the truth about him." They spent 2 weeks in the mountains. Planning. Jake contacted old associates, men who operated outside the law but had their own code of honor. Slowly, carefully, they gathered information, and what they learned changed everything. Thomas Bradshaw hadn't just lied about Grace. There were others. A Mexican girl in Tucson who disappeared after accusing him of assault. A young widow in Silver City who'd left town suddenly after Bradshaw's business visit. A pattern, hidden by money and influence and the assumption that a banker's son was above suspicion. Maria Gonzalez. Grace read from a letter Jake's contact had provided. 16 years old. Her family says Bradshaw attacked her after a church social. When she tried to report it, Sheriff Watson threatened to deport her entire family. The widow was named Sarah Fleming. Jake added. Left behind a letter with her sister. Too scared to make it public. Same story. Bradshaw cornered her. She fought him off. He threatened to ruin her if she talked. Grace's hands trembled with rage. How many others? How many women has he destroyed while playing the gentleman? We're about to find out, Jake said grimly. But Grace, exposing this won't be easy. His family has power, money, and we have the truth. Sometimes that's not enough. Then we'll make it enough. They rode back toward Redemption Creek on a moonless night, taking back trails Jake knew from his outlaw days. But instead of entering the town, they made camp in the hills above it. Over the next days, Jake slipped into town disguised, gathering more information, making contact with unexpected allies. Lily Stewart, Grace's old friend, met him behind the old mission one evening, her face pale with fear and determination. "I've been sick about what happened to Grace," she whispered, glancing around nervously. We all knew something wasn't right about Thomas's story, but nobody dared speak up. "Would you speak up now?" Jake asked. "If you had proof." Lily bit her lip. "My cousin Emma told me Thomas tried to corner her too, at the summer picnic. She's been afraid to say anything, but yes, if Grace is willing to stand up, we'll stand with her." One by one, they found them. Women who'd been silent, men who'd witnessed things they'd been paid to forget, even some who'd simply grown disgusted with the Bradshaw family's stranglehold on the town. But as their network of truth grew, so did the danger. Jake came back from town one night with a split lip and bruised ribs. "Watson's deputies," he explained as Grace tended his wounds. "They're watching for me everywhere. And Grace, your father's been preaching special sermons about wayward daughters and the men who corrupt them. He's working folks into a frenzy. Let him preach," Grace said fiercely. "Soon enough, he'll have to answer for his lies." The storm that had been building finally broke on a Sunday morning. Grace and Jake had spent the night praying. She to a God she was trying to understand again. He to whatever force governed justice in this harsh land. "You sure about this?" Jake asked one final time as they prepared to ride. "I'm sure." Grace had traded her travel-worn clothes for a simple but respectable dress they'd acquired, her hair pinned up properly. She looked like the preacher's daughter again, except for the steel in her eyes. They rode into Redemption Creek just as the church bells began to ring. The streets were empty, everyone already gathered for service. Perfect. Inside the church, Reverend Hartley was mid-sermon, his voice rising and falling in familiar rhythms. "And like Jezebel of old, she has fallen into corruption, leading good men astray with her wanton..." The church doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the sanctuary. Every head turned as Grace walked down the center aisle, Jake beside her, both of them focused on the pulpit where her father stood frozen. "Speaking of me, Father," Grace's voice carried to every corner, "then perhaps I should give my own testimony." The congregation erupted. Some people rose to their feet, others shrank back. Sheriff Watson and his deputies moved to block the aisle, but Jake's hand rested meaningfully on his gun. "Let her speak," a voice called out. Lily Stewart stood up in her pew. "She has the right to speak." "She has no rights here," Reverend Hartley thundered. "Sheriff, arrest these criminals." "On what charges?" Grace asked, still advancing. "Being innocent? Or is it a crime now to defend yourself against a predator?" She'd reached the front of the church now, turning to face the congregation. Thomas Bradshaw sat in his family pew, his face pale, a new scratch visible on his neck. "Another fight, Thomas?" Grace asked sweetly. Another woman who wouldn't submit quietly. "Silence," her father roared. But Grace continued. "I stayed silent once. We all did. But I've learned that silence is what allows evil to flourish." She pulled out a packet of letters. Maria Gonzalez, Sarah Fleming, Emma Morrison, Catherine Bell. "Should I continue? Should I read their words, their accusations against the gentleman you all protect?" "Mrs. Bradshaw shot to her feet. "How dare you? These are lies! Slander!" "Then let him deny it," Grace challenged. "Let Thomas stand before God and this congregation and deny that he attacked these women. Let him deny that he's used his family's wealth and influence to silence his victims." All eyes turned to Thomas. He opened his mouth, closed it, his usual smooth words failing him. "Thomas," his mother prompted, "tell them it's not true." But Emma Morrison had found her courage. She stood up, voice shaking but clear. "It is true. He cornered me at the summer picnic. If my brother hadn't come looking for me—" She trailed off, tears streaming down her face. Another woman stood. Then another, not speaking, just standing, bearing witness. The silence in the church grew heavy, suffocating. "You orchestrated this," Reverend Hartley said, his voice deadly quiet as he stared at Grace. "You've corrupted these women with your lies. The only lie told in this church was yours." Jake spoke for the first time. "When you chose to believe a predator over your own daughter, when you cast her out for refusing to be silent about the truth. An outlaw's word means nothing here," Watson blustered. "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But theirs does." He gestured to the women standing throughout the congregation. "Are they all liars too, Sheriff, all corrupted? Or is it possible that the real corruption has been hiding behind wealth and respectability?" Thomas finally found his voice. "You can't prove anything. It's their word against mine, and everyone knows what kind of women make these accusations." The crack of Jake's gun was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet buried itself in the pew inches from Thomas's hand. "Choose your next words real careful, boy," Jake said coldly. "You're talking about the woman I love." In the stunned silence that followed, Grace felt something shift inside her chest. The woman I love. He'd said it before God and everyone. This outlaw who'd believed in her innocence when the whole world condemned her. "You love her?" Reverend Hartley's voice was hollow. This fallen creature?" "I love a woman who faced exile rather than live a lie." Jake replied, "A woman who survived the desert, fought bounty hunters, and still had the courage to come back here and face her accusers. If that makes her fallen, then I'll take fallen over your kind of righteousness any day." The church doors opened again. More women entered, some young, some old, all with the same look in their eyes. The truth, long buried, was rising like floodwater, impossible to stop. "Enough!" Thomas bolted for the side door, but found his way blocked by men of the town, fathers, brothers, husbands who'd heard enough. Sheriff Watson looked around the church, seeing which way the wind was blowing. "Thomas Bradshaw, you're under arrest." "For what, Mrs.?" Bradshaw shrieked. "We'll start with assault and go from there," Watson replied. his political instincts finally overcoming his loyalty to the Bradshaw money. "Seems we've got plenty of witnesses." As the deputies led Thomas away, Reverend Hartley descended from his pulpit. He stood before Grace, this daughter he'd cast out, and for the first time, truly saw her. "I was wrong," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. Lord forgive me, I was wrong." Grace studied her father's face, seeing the beginning of real anguish there, but she also knew that some wounds went too deep for simple apologies. "I forgive you, Father," she said quietly. "But I can't forget, and I can't come back to being the daughter you wanted me to be." She turned to Jake, who offered his arm. Together, they walked back down the aisle, through the congregation that parted before them. At the door, Grace paused, looking back one last time. "For any woman here who's been silenced," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "know this, your truth matters. Your voice matters, and you are not alone." Outside, in the bright morning sun, Grace breathed deeply of the free air. Jake's hand found hers, warm and steady. "So what now?" he asked. "Where do we go from here?" Grace looked up at him. This outlaw who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved. "Wherever we want," she said. And for the first time in her life, she truly meant it. The aftermath of the church confrontation rippled through Redemption Creek like an earthquake. Thomas Bradshaw sat in the town jail, his family's lawyers already on their way from Phoenix. But more importantly, the silence that had protected him for years had finally shattered. Grace and Jake had taken rooms at the boarding house. Mrs. Abernathy, shamefaced over her earlier rejection, had insisted they stay free of charge. But their presence in town remained a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came 3 days later. Grace was at the general store, purchasing supplies for their eventual departure, when Mrs. Bradshaw swept in. The older woman's carefully maintained composure had cracked, leaving something wild and dangerous in its wake. "You destroyed my son," she hissed, backing Grace against the counter. "You and your lies have ruined everything we'd built. Your son destroyed himself." Grace replied evenly. "I just stopped hiding it." Mrs. Bradshaw's hand flashed out, striking Grace across the face. The store went silent. Grace touched her cheek, feeling the sting, but didn't retaliate. "Is that supposed to make me take it back?" Grace asked quietly. "Violence seems to run in your family. You little—" "That's enough." Jake's voice came from the doorway, cold as winter iron. "Touch her again, and grieving mother or not, you'll answer to me." Mrs. Bradshaw turned on him. "This is your doing. You corrupted her, turned her into this creature who destroys good families." "Good families?" Emma Morrison had entered behind Jake, followed by 3 other women. "Your good son tried to force himself on me, on all of us. The only thing Grace destroyed was our silence." The confrontation might have escalated, but Sheriff Watson arrived, looking haggard. "Mrs. Bradshaw, I think you should go home. Your lawyers are at your house." As the woman stormed out, Watson turned to Jake and Grace. "You two need to be careful. The Bradshaw family has connections all over the territory. This isn't over." He was right. That night, as Grace and Jake sat in the boarding house parlor, a brick crashed through the window, wrapped in a note. "Get out or burn with the building." Jake was on his feet instantly, guns drawn. But the street outside was empty. Grace picked up the brick, reading the message with steady hands. "We can't stay," she said. "I won't put Mrs. Abernathy and the other boarders at risk." "Running again?" Jake's jaw was tight. "I'm getting mighty tired of being chased off by cowards and bullies." "This isn't running." Grace stood, resolve firming. "This is choosing our battlefield. Jake, I need to testify. Officially, in a court of law. The circuit judge won't be through for 2 months. Not here, in Phoenix, at the territorial courthouse, where the Bradshaw money might buy influence but can't buy everyone." She met his eyes. "I want this on record, all of it. Not just for me, but for every woman who's been silenced." Jake studied her face, seeing the determination there. That's a dangerous road. The Bradshaws will throw everything they have at stopping you. Then we'd better be ready. They left Redemption Creek at dawn, but not alone. Lily Stewart and Emma Morrison rode with them, along with 2 other women who'd decided to testify. Jake had also recruited unexpected allies, 3 former outlaws who owed him favors and had no love for wealthy families who crushed common folk. Never thought I'd be riding protection for a preacher's daughter. One of them, a grizzled man named Dutch, commented, "Former preacher's daughter." Grace corrected. "Now I'm just a woman seeking justice. Even better." Dutch grinned. "Justice and me got a long-standing relationship." The journey to Phoenix took 5 days through increasingly hostile territory. The Bradshaw influence ran deep, and they found doors closed to them in towns along the way. Twice, groups of riders shadowed them, turned back only by the obvious firepower of their escort. On the 4th night, camped in a box canyon, the shadows became substance. "Riders coming," Dutch called from his watch position. "Dozen, maybe more." They arranged themselves defensively, the women in the center, the men forming a protective circle. Jake handed Grace a rifle. "You remember what I taught you? Squeeze, don't jerk. Aim for the center. Don't waste ammunition." She checked the load with steady hands. "I remember everything you taught me." The riders appeared at the canyon mouth, hired guns from their look, led by a man in an expensive suit who could only be one of the Bradshaw lawyers. "Miss Hartley," he called out. "I'm Marcus Whitman, attorney for the Bradshaw family. I've been authorized to make you an offer." "Not interested." Grace called back. $5,000 each, all charges dropped against Mr. Bradshaw, and everyone goes their separate ways peacefully. Emma Morrison laughed bitterly. "You want to buy our silence again?" "I want to avoid unnecessary bloodshed." Whitman replied. "Be reasonable. Ladies, you're outnumbered and outgunned." "Are we?" Jake's voice carried clearly. "Dutch, show Mr. Whitman what he's facing." Dutch lit a torch, revealing their defensive position, rocks for cover, clear fields of fire, and most importantly, the dozen rifles trained on the canyon mouth. "First rule of ambushing, counselor." Jake continued. "Make sure you got the only way out. Your boys might take some of us, but none of you are leaving this canyon alive. That the kind of case you want to argue?" Whitman's hired guns shifted nervously. They were used to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, not facing men who'd lived by the gun. "This isn't over," Whitman warned. "No," Grace agreed, standing up so he could see her clearly. "It's just beginning. And Mr. Whitman, tell the Bradshaws that their money can't buy back my innocence or silence my truth. I'll see them in court." The standoff stretched taut. Then Whitman made a gesture and his men withdrew. They listened to the hoofbeats fade before anyone relaxed. "They'll try again," Dutch predicted. "Let them," Grace said fiercely. Each attempt just proves how much they fear the truth. Phoenix sprawled before them in the territorial heat. A city trying to civilize itself with courthouses and churches, while saloons still outnumbered both. Jake secured rooms at a respectable hotel, using some of his carefully hoarded funds. "Never thought I'd be spending my ill-gotten gains on lawyers and court fees," he commented wryly. They found an attorney named Samuel Hartfield, young, idealistic, and most importantly, new to the territory with no ties to established families. He listened to their story with growing outrage. "This is exactly the kind of case that needs to be heard," he said. "But I won't lie. It'll be ugly. The Bradshaws will dig into everyone's past, try to destroy your credibility." "My credibility is already destroyed," Grace said calmly. "I'm a fallen woman, cast out by my own father, but that might work in our favor, because I have nothing left to lose." And someone with nothing to lose is dangerous to people who built their power on others' fear. The legal maneuvering began immediately. The Bradshaw lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to block the testimony, discredit the witnesses, move the venue to a friendlier court. But Hartfield fought back with surprising skill, and public opinion began to shift. The newspaper coverage helped. A young reporter named Patricia Collins had taken interest in the case, writing about the women brave enough to stand against a powerful family. Her articles sparked discussions in parlors and saloons alike about justice, power, and the price of silence. The night before the hearing, Jake found Grace on the hotel balcony, staring out at the city lights. "Scared?" he asked, joining her at the rail. "Terrified," she admitted. "But not of them. I'm scared of what happens after, win or lose. Who am I when this is over?" Jake turned her to face him. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You're someone who chose truth over comfort, courage over safety, and—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "You're the woman I want to spend my life with, if you'll have me." Grace's breath caught. "Jake Harlan, is that a proposal?" "It's a promise," he corrected. "However this ends, whatever comes next, I want to face it with you. I know I'm not what your father dreamed for you." "My father's dreams nearly destroyed me," Grace interrupted. "I'll take my own dreams. Thank you. And they include a certain outlaw who believed in my innocence when no one else would." He kissed her then, there on the balcony with the city as witness. And Grace felt something settle in her soul. Not peace exactly. She'd learned peace was for people who'd never had to fight for their truth. But something better. Purpose. The courthouse was packed the next morning. The Bradshaw family sat in force. Parents, cousins, business associates. But for every supporter they'd brought, 2 more had come to hear the women testify. Grace took the stand first, Hartfield leading her through the events of that October night. She spoke clearly, meeting the eyes of the judge, the court reporter, the gallery, when the Bradshaw lawyer cross-examined, trying to paint her as a temptress who'd lured poor Thomas. She remained calm. "If I had tried to seduce Mr. Bradshaw," she said evenly, "why would I fight him off? Why would I run? Your version makes no sense. Perhaps you were playing games, leading him on, like he played games with Maria Gonzalez? With Sarah Fleming? How many games? Counselor. Before we call it what it is, a pattern of predation?" Emma testified next, then Lily speaking as a character witness, then 2 more women who'd traveled to Phoenix when they heard about the hearing. With each testimony, Thomas Bradshaw seemed to shrink in his seat. Finally, surprisingly, Reverend Josiah Hartley took the stand. "I am not here to defend my daughter," he said, his voice heavy. "I am here to confess my own sin. I chose reputation over righteousness. I chose the word of a wealthy family over my own flesh and blood. I failed as a father and as a minister of God." The courtroom was silent as he continued. "I've spent these weeks reading scripture with new eyes. The truth shall set you free. Christ said, but I chose bondage to lies rather than freedom in truth. My daughter, Grace, she chose freedom. That makes her the better Christian." When all testimony was complete, Judge Morrison, no relation to Emma, deliberated for less than an hour. "While this court cannot overturn the social judgments passed on Miss Hartley," he said, "it can and does find credible evidence of a pattern of assault and intimidation by Thomas Bradshaw. The court recommends criminal charges be filed immediately." The courtroom erupted. The Bradshaw contingent stormed out, shouting about appeals and revenge. But Grace sat quietly, Jake's hand in hers, feeling the weight of months lifting from her shoulders. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Patricia Collins pushed to the front. "Miss Hartley, what will you do now?" Grace looked at Jake, at the women who'd stood with her, at her father who waited awkwardly nearby. "Now," she smiled, and it was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Now I live, freely, honestly, without shame. With an outlaw?" someone called out. "With a man who saw my truth when the world saw only lies," Grace corrected. "If that makes him an outlaw, then yes, with an outlaw." As they walked down the courthouse steps into the bright Phoenix morning, Grace felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer the preacher's daughter, no longer the shamed woman. She was simply Grace, and that was enough. "So," Jake said as they reached the street. "Where to now?" Grace considered. "I hear California is nice. Ocean views, new beginnings." Sounds perfect, Jake agreed. Then, louder, to their gathered friends, "Who's for California?" A small cheer went up. Even Dutch grinned. Always wanted to see the Pacific. As they made their plans, Grace noticed her father approaching hesitantly. "Grace, could we speak?" She studied him, this man who'd shaped and scarred her life in equal measure. "You can write to me," she said finally. "General delivery. San Francisco. Maybe someday we can find our way back to each other, but not today." He nodded, accepting the judgment. "I'll pray for you." "Pray for yourself first," Grace suggested gently. "Pray for the courage to see people as they are, not as you think they should be." As the sun climbed toward noon, the unlikely group set out, former outlaws and vindicated women, heading west toward new possibilities. Grace rode beside Jake, no longer running from anything but riding toward something better. The preacher's daughter had been shamed. But the woman who emerged from that shame had claimed not just her innocence, but her freedom. And that, Grace thought as the desert opened before them, was the greatest truth of all. The news from Phoenix spread like wildfire through the territories. Thomas Bradshaw had been formally charged with multiple counts of assault. His family's influence couldn't stop the tide of justice once it began to flow. But in Redemption Creek, the aftermath was more complex than simple victory. Grace received letters at the hotel in Phoenix, some supportive, others venomous. But one stood out, written in Lily Stewart's careful hand. "The town is divided. Some say you're a hero. Others claim you've destroyed a good family. But something has changed here. Women are speaking up, demanding to be heard. Your courage gave us permission to have our own." Jake found Grace reading the letter on the hotel veranda, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Regrets?" he asked gently. "No," she said firmly. I never meant to be anyone's symbol. I just wanted to be believed. Sometimes that's the most revolutionary thing a person can do," Jake replied. "Especially a woman in a world that prefers silence." They'd been in Phoenix a week, waiting for the legal proceedings to solidify. Jake had been cleared of charges related to kidnapping Grace, though his past crimes still shadowed him. It was Dutch who suggested the solution. "California's got that amnesty program for reformed outlaws," he said over dinner. "Man agrees to go straight. They wipe the slate clean. Might be worth considering." Jake bristled. "I'm not apologizing for defending myself against corrupt lawmen. Nobody's asking you to." Grace interjected. "But Jake, we can't build a future always looking over our shoulders if there's a legal way to be free." He studied her face, seeing the hope there. "You really want to try for a normal life? After everything?" "I want to try for an honest life," Grace corrected. "Normal is just another word for what other people expect. I'm done living by those expectations." The Bradshaw family made one last attempt to stop them. Grace woke one morning to find a man in her room, not threatening, just standing there with an envelope. Jake burst through the connecting door, gun drawn, but the man raised empty hands. "Just a messenger," he said quickly. "Mr. Bradshaw Sr. wants to make one final offer." "Get out," Jake growled. "Wait," Grace said. "Let's hear it. I want to know what my truth is worth to them." The man handed her the envelope and departed quickly. Inside was a bank draft for $20,000 and a single condition: leave the territory and never speak of the matter again. Grace studied the draft. More money than she'd ever dreamed of. Enough to start fresh anywhere. To live comfortably for years. "That's a lot of money," Jake observed carefully. Grace walked to the lamp, lit the corner of the draft, and dropped it in the wash basin. They watched it burn to ash. "My innocence was never for sale," she said simply. "Not for $500 when my father cast me out. Not for $20,000 now. Some things can't be bought back once they're taken." That afternoon, Reverend Hartley arrived in Phoenix. Grace met him in the hotel garden, Jake standing watchfully nearby. "I've resigned from the church," her father said without preamble. "I can't preach about truth when I've lived such a lie." Grace felt a pang despite everything. "That church was your life's work." "No," he corrected quietly. You were supposed to be my life's work, raising you, protecting you, believing in you. I failed at what truly mattered." They sat in silence for a moment before he continued. "I've been offered a position at a small mission in California. Teaching, not preaching. Working with people who need second chances." He met her eyes. "I know I have no right to ask, but might there be room in your new life for a foolish old man trying to learn better?" Grace felt Jake's hand on her shoulder. Supportive, but not pushing either way. She thought of all the sermons about forgiveness she'd heard growing up. How hollow they'd seemed when she needed forgiveness from those who claimed to love her. "I won't be your daughter again," she said finally. "Not the way I was, but perhaps we could learn to know each other as the people we're becoming, not the people we were." Hope flickered in his weathered face. "That's more than I deserve." "Yes," Grace agreed. "It is. But then, we all need more grace than we deserve sometimes." 2 weeks later, they set out for California, a strange caravan of redemption seekers. Jake and Grace rode side by side, followed by Dutch and 2 other former outlaws seeking amnesty. Emma Morrison had decided to join them, eager to start fresh where her story wasn't known. Even Reverend Hartley traveled with them, humble now in ways his pride had never allowed before. The journey took 3 weeks through varying terrain, desert giving way to mountains, mountains to valleys green with promise. Jake taught Grace to read the land like a book, to find water where none seemed to exist, to navigate by stars when clouds obscured the moon. "You're turning me into a proper outlaw," Grace teased one evening as she successfully tracked a deer to water. "Reformed outlaw," Jake corrected with a grin. "We're going respectable, remember? Respectable," Grace mused. "I tried that once. I think I prefer authentic instead." They were married in a small ceremony in Los Angeles, in a garden overlooking the Pacific. Dutch stood as Jake's witness, Emma as Grace's. Reverend Hartley performed the ceremony, his voice breaking only once when he spoke of 2 people finding light in darkness. "Do you, Grace, take this man?" He paused, seeming to truly see Jake for the first time. "This good man who saw your truth when the world was blind, to be your lawful husband." "I do," Grace said clearly, her eyes never leaving Jake's. "And do you, Jake, take this woman, this brave woman who chose honesty over safety, to be your lawful wife, every day for the rest of my life?" Jake vowed. As they kissed, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Even proper Emma whistled, then blushed at her own boldness. The reception was held at a nearby hotel, simple but joyful. Patricia Collins had traveled from Phoenix to cover the wedding. Her article would later be titled "From Shame to Freedom, a Love Story of the New West." As the sun set over the ocean, Jake and Grace walked along the beach, still in their wedding clothes. "No regrets?" Jake asked, an echo of his earlier question. Grace looked back at their friends celebrating on the terrace, at her father laughing at something Dutch had said, at Emma dancing with a young man who'd been charmed by her story of courage. "How can I regret the path that brought me here?" she replied. "Every cruel word, every cold night, every moment of despair, they all led to you. To this, to freedom, the preacher's daughter and the outlaw." Jake mused. Who would have believed it? "No," Grace corrected, pulling him close. "Just Jake and Grace, 2 people who found truth in a world full of lies." They returned to the celebration as stars began to appear over the Pacific. The hotel pianist began playing, and couples moved on to the small dance floor. Jake offered Grace's hand with exaggerated formality. "Mrs. Harlan, may I have this dance?" "Mr. Harlan, you may have every dance," she replied. As they moved together, Grace thought of that horrible night at the Harvest Festival that had started everything. Thomas Bradshaw had torn her sleeve, trying to steal what wasn't his. But in fighting back, in refusing to be silent, she'd gained so much more than she'd lost. Later, as the party wound down, Reverend Hartley approached them one last time. "Your mother would have loved him," he told Grace quietly. "She always said you needed someone who could match your spirit, not break it." It was the first time he'd mentioned Grace's mother in years, The woman who'd died when Grace was 12, taking with her the softer parts of Josiah Hartley. She would have loved the woman you've become, he continued, stronger than I ever allowed you to be. Grace hugged her father then, briefly but genuinely. We all have further to go, she said, but at least we're moving forward. As the evening ended, Jake and Grace stood on their hotel balcony, looking out at the vast Pacific. Somewhere behind them, the desert stretched endlessly, holding their past like a fossil in stone. But ahead, the ocean promised new horizons. What now? Grace asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. Now we live, Jake replied. Honestly, freely, together. No more running? No more running, he confirmed. Though I make no promises about the occasional adventure. Grace laughed, the sound carrying on the salt wind. I wouldn't have it any other way. In the distance, a ship's horn sounded, vessels coming and going from the harbor, carrying people to new lives and new chances. Grace thought of all the women still trapped in silence, all the men still bound by others' expectations. Her fight had been for herself, but perhaps it had opened doors for others too. Jake, she said softly, I want to help them. Other women who've been silenced. I don't know how yet, but we'll figure it out, he assured her. Together. As they retired for the night, Grace took one last look at the stars. The same stars that had witnessed her shame now blessed her joy. The preacher's daughter had died in that church in Redemption Creek, but the woman born from that death was someone altogether more powerful, herself. The story that began with shame had transformed into something else entirely, a testament to the power of truth, the strength found in solidarity, and the unexpected places where love can bloom. In the wild frontier where might too often made right. One woman's refusal to be silenced had changed everything, and as Grace Harlan fell asleep in her husband's arms, the ocean singing them a lullaby of endless possibilities, she knew the greatest adventure was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this story of love, justice, and redemption in the Wild West. If you're enjoying these tales of the frontier, please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We love connecting with our audience from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Grace and Jake's journey. What did you think of their story? We'd love to hear your perspective.